So my guess, it was probably a $35,000, $40,000 job for his daily driver. So as an employee of Ferrari of Central Florida in 2000, one of the unique aspects of the job of working in the showroom and moving cars around was actually being able to interact with the people who came in day to day, just to look at them, dream, and sometimes buy. Sometimes they were already owners with vehicles in the back for service. One of my jobs was to actually just talk up the people in the showroom, just be friendly, because they didn't like necessarily the salespeople always going up and kind of being forceful, but I had a different uniform. They could tell I was just an innocent person not trying to sell or push anything on them. So I struck up a conversation one day with a gentleman who walked in who could have been Jimmy Buffett's brother. Very laid back, shorts, t-shirts, sandals, very easy to talk to. One of the nicest people I'd ever had come into the dealership and actually give me the time of day. We were just talking about, various cars on there. He had a love of the Dino that was there, and I always loved the lines of that car, even though it was the V6 and maybe a little underpowered to some. I just always had an affinity for that. And of course there was the F40 and the LM, and we'd talk about that. And I don't remember this particular day of outside the Dino, any car that we really spent time talking about. Probably about after 15 or 20 minutes, I was like, so do you have a car here that's being worked on? Are you interested in any of these? Like, what brings you in today? He's like, oh, well, I've got my car in the back getting service. It's he called it one of his daily drivers. Okay. I was like, oh, really? Which one? He's like, oh, it's that old 60s bucket in the back. And I knew there were no vintage ones back there except for the 500 Superfast. And if you're not familiar with what that is, I implore you to go to Google and look up the images, because they are just an elegant, grand touring Ferrari of the day. They're absolutely gorgeous. And at the time, they were well over $1 million. And I was like, daily driver, interesting. And it had the miles to boot. It had, I think at the time, 70,000, 80,000 miles on it, which for an early 60s Ferrari is ground shaking, right? And I knew it was in for a radiator, because we had talked earlier that morning. Wow, what's this car engine? It was in for a radiator from Modena for $25,000 for the radiator alone, not including shipping or installation. So my guess, it was probably a $35,000, $40,000 job for his daily driver, and he was really excited. I knew the numbers in my head. I didn't let on that I knew those numbers in my head. I tried to play it off. I'd been in the dealership a few months now, so I'd been around high dollar things and transactions enough to not look like an idiot when I think, oh my gosh, that's a lot of money just for a radiator. So I was like, really? And I was like, well, that's a beautiful vehicle. He's like, yeah, that's one of 13 in my Ferrari collection. And he said it like, what do you want from the store? As easy as that. And I was starting to lose that cool of playing it off. And I was like, one of 13. He's like, yeah, that's part of the Ferrari collection. I probably have a problem of over collecting. He's like, but it's all right. My wife let me finally break ground on the garage, so I've got a place for it. I was like, well, that's fantastic. And I kind of let it go from there, because I realized this is a different animal I'm talking with right now. Very nice, but it was time for me to go back and ask some questions and just maybe give him some space. So I go back to the manager, and I was like, what is the story on him and this garage, and why it was such a challenge for his wife to okay it? Turns out the garage was 5,000 square feet that the city had just approved because they were in Winter Park, which is a very well-guarded area of just building new construction on their homes. And he had finally gotten approval from the city and his wife to break ground on as you can imagine, a 5,000 square foot garage to house your car collection is significant when you're talking about, Central Orlando. He was happy as a lark. He picked it up and sure enough drove off in the vintage 60s Superfast. And it just sounded glorious. And still to this day, I don't think outside of, people like Jay Leno and the Countach with 80,000+ miles on it, you just don't see those type of cars being driven and enjoyed and used and exercised as really, honestly, they should. It's a great side of seeing the people that could come in there and be really approachable. So in a new car dealership, it was unique with him because they didn't really bother throwing new car deals at him all the time because he had the collection to show. If he wanted to buy a new 360, he'd buy a new 360. But the value was just, he was there to get a service done. And if you think about it, it was almost like a Nicolas Cage in Gone in 60 Seconds. Going into dealership said, this is great, this new one, but I'm a connoisseur. What I really want is this. And it's the vintage, and it's the class. And that's really where I started to experience like the different levels of buyers. Not even buyers at that point, actually, the ownership experience that can be had from something from like Ferrari.